Hi, hello, welcome to today's lesson. So, today I am going to teach grade 10th social science NCRT India and the Contemporary World Part 2, Chapter 2. So, India and the Contemporary World under Part 2, the first chapter you have learned about the rise of nationalism in Europe. But in chapter 2, we are going to learn about nationalism in India. So, this is the first part I am going to teach from this chapter 2, that is about nationalism in India. So, before going to learn the detailed information about nationalism in India, you should know about the learning objectives. The first learning objective is knowledge. So, students will get the knowledge about Indian national movement started from 1757 from the Battle of Plassey to 1947 till getting independence. And also students are able to get the knowledge about the Battle of Buxar, the first war of Indian independence, and the other important movements started by the Mahatma Gandhi in 1920, that is non-cooperation movement. Then one more last most important movement, that is Quit India movement. So all these movements information, then students will get the knowledge. And the second important objective is understanding. Students will understand about the national movement from 1885 to 1947. In this, students will understand the national movement is divided into three major parts. One is from 1885 to 1905, which was under the control of moderates, and from 1905 to 1919 the national movement was led by the extremists. From 1919 to till 1947 the national movement was under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. And also students can analyze what kind of movements are rising in India against the state and the central governments. And at last students are able to locate the places in India wherever the national movements started by the different national leaders. So all these are the main objectives of this chapter, and we are going to learn the main learning outcomes of this chapter are: the first learning outcome is students will be able to critically think about how advent of Mahatma Gandhi turn around the political movement in India, which means till 1919 Indian national movement was under the control of moderates and the extremists. Then when Mahatma Gandhi entered in India in 1915, then it was led by the Mahatma Gandhi from 1920. That entire his leadership and the movements started by Mahatma Gandhi till 1947. Everything they are able to understand and they are able to explain. Then the second learning outcome is students will be able to develop citizenship through understanding the contribution of the common man in the anti-colonial movement in India. Means they are able to understand the role of Indians and the leaders of Indians and their contribution against the British East India Company. Then how India got its independence, how the Indians sacrificed their life towards the freedom. That entire information they are able to explain from this chapter. So these are the learning outcomes from the chapter 2, that is about nationalism in India. Now the main topics which we are going to learn from this chapter are, the first one is introduction, which means in introduction you are going to learn till 1920 what happened in Indian history, which means which was the first step for the entry of European traders in India. That is from 1498, the discovery of sea route to India by the Vasco da Gama, then the Portuguese traders, then Dutch traders, like other European traders, establishment of their trade centers in different parts of the country. Then after establishment of their trade centers in India till 1919, what happened in India, that a detailed information you can learn under the introduction part. Then you are going to learn about the First World War, Khilafat and non-cooperation movement from 1919 to 1922. These two incidents and the detailed information and the consequences of First World War you will learn from the topic 2, that is about the First World War, Khilafat and non-cooperation movement. Under the topic 3, you are going to learn differing strands within the movement, means the movements started in India and the different ideas and the different methods followed against to the British government, that you can learn from this third topic. And in the fourth topic, towards civil disobedience movement, and at last you are going to learn the sense of collective belonging. These are the main topics which you are going to learn history chapter 2, that is about the rise of nationalism in India. So first we will go to the introduction about nationalism in India. So basically this chapter tells us about the Indian national movement which started from 1920 to 1947. Means from this chapter we are going to learn a detailed information about the Indian national movement from 1920 to 1947. So but before going to learn this detailed information, we should have a basic knowledge what happened in Indian history up to 1920. So that basic knowledge is required. So that is why now I am going to explain a clear cut, a very detailed information about the Indian national movement up to 1919 in Indian history, that you are going to learn from today's topic. Okay, let me start the first topic about the first step is the discovery of sea route to India. I think everybody knows that the basic step to the foreign traders to India was, that is 1498, Vasco da Gama discovered a sea route to India. Do you know who was Vasco da Gama? Vasco da Gama, he was a Portuguese explorer who discovered sea route to India in 1498. This was the basic step. Then after the discovery of sea route to India by Vasco da Gama in 1498, the Portuguese traders came to India and they took the permission from the Indian local leaders and the rulers and had established their trade centers in the different parts of the country. Because at the time India had the variety and the rich valuable resources, so which are essential in the European markets. So by purchasing these goods from the Indians at cheaper rates and by selling these goods in the European markets at higher prices, These European traders wanted to get the huge profit from the Indian trade. That is why these Portuguese traders had established their trade centers in India, and they started collecting the materials from the Indians with cheaper rates. So by seeing these traders and their profit, then other European traders also came to India. They also took the permission from the Indian leaders, and they also had established their trade centers in different parts of the country. So at second, the Dutch traders came to India. Dutch traders means the traders who came to India from the Netherlands are called as the Dutch traders. So after Dutch traders, the followed by the third one is the British traders. That is, they took the permission from the Queen in England, and they also took the permission from the Indian local leaders, local rulers, and they also had established their trade centers in the east and the west coast. Then followed by the another, that is European company, that is the Danish. Danish traders means the traders who came to India from the Denmark are called as the Danish traders. And at last the French traders came to India. So thus the Vasco da Gama discovered sea route to India in 1498 was the first step for the entry of European traders to India. So then after establishment of all these trading companies in India, what happened we will learn in the next slide. So before that, now we can see very clearly. So these European companies, especially the first, we can learn about the Portuguese traders. Portuguese traders had established their trade center first at Goa, and the second trade center they had established at Dadra Nagar Haveli, and the third trade center they had established at Darren, and the fourth trade center they had established at Dayu. Like that, these Portuguese traders had established their trading centers in the west coast. Why they had established their trading centers only in the west coast means, so for whatever the goods they are collecting from the Indians, they are purchasing from the Indians, so to export to their countries it is easy from the coastal areas only. That is why almost all the Portuguese trade centers had established in the west coastal line. This is the main reason. So the next two trading companies are, one is the French traders had established their trade center at Mahe, which is located on the west coast, and their second trade center had established on the east coast, that is at Karaikal, and the third important trading center they had established on the east coast, that is at the Pondicherry, and at last they had established these French traders on the east coast only, that is Chandar Nagar. So these four are the important trade centers established by the French traders. Once again, now the trading centers Goa, Dadra Nagar Haveli, Darren and Dayu, these four trade centers were established by the Portuguese traders, and in Mahe, Karaikal, Pondicherry and Chandar Nagar, these four areas the trade centers were established by the French traders in India. Then from this map we are able to understand the important trade centers which were established by the Dutch traders. The first establishment of trade center in India by the Dutch traders is at Cochin on the west coast, and the second one is on the east coast, that is at Nagapatnam, and the third one is at on east coast Pulicat, and the fourth one is Masulipattnam, it is also on the east coast, and on east coast, that is one more is Sinsura. These are the important trade centers and in many other places also they had established their trade centers. But these are the major trade centers which had been established by the Dutch traders on the coastal areas. So now we will learn about the trade centers which are established by the Danish. One is Tranquebar, which is one of the important trade center, which is located the area between the Tamil Nadu and Karnataka border, Kerala border. The second trade center was established by the Danish traders as Srirampur, which is located in the West Bengal. This area is located at present between the Jharkhand and the West Bengal. So these were the two important trade centers were established by the Danish traders. And at last the British East India Company had established their trade centers first at on western coast, that is at Mahe, and the second one is on eastern coast, that is on Pondicherry. Third one is on east coast, that is at Yanam, and fourth one is Hooghly and Chandarnagar. These were the important trade centers had established by the British East India Company and other European traders in India. Okay, now we will learn what happened after the establishment of all these European traders in India. So after the establishment of all these trading companies in India, all these trading companies, they were engaged in wars with each other, because the main motto of all these European trading companies were to get huge profit from the Indians trade, and they wanted to control the entire Indian markets. So because of that reason, these were engaged in wars with each other. But finally the other European companies, they did not compete with the Britishers, because at the time British East India Company had large army, and the army was well trained, and they had the weapons and the well technology. So because of that reason, the other European traders like the Portuguese traders, Dutch traders, Denmark traders and the French traders, they did not compete with the East India Company, and they left the country. Thus East India Company, only one company was there in India in the 18th century. So after the establishment of their trade centers both in the east and the west coast, in some areas they did not take permission from the local Nawabs, and they started fortification and they started construction of their trade centers. So this incident was happened in the Bengal province. Bengal was one of the largest province at the time in India, which was under the control of Alivardi Khan, and after the death of Alivardi Khan, his grandson Siraz Uddaulla became the Nawab of Bengal in 1757. So without the permission of Nawab of Bengal, that is Siraz Uddaulla, the British East India Company had started the fortification and many other constructions at Kolkata. Thus, Nawab of Bengal, that is Siraz Uddaulla, he did not like the Britishers, those who are growing powerful in the Bengal province. That is why he tried to drive the Britishers from India. So, whatever the constructions are going on by the British East India Company, thus Siraz Uddaulla attacked on these construction areas and occupied these areas. So thus what happened here, Siraz Uddaulla, he had one army commander, his name was Mir Jafar. So at the same time East India Company had one main army commander, he was known as the Robert Clive. So Robert Clive did not like the actions taken by the Siraz Uddaulla in the Bengal province. Then he made a secret conspiracy with the army commander of Siraz Uddaulla, that is Mir Jafar, and he promised to the Mir Jafar that he would support to the East India Company in the battle between the Siraz Uddaulla and the British East India Company. Then after the battle, then he would become the Nawab of Bengal. So he had given a promise, and he made a secret conspiracy with the Mir Jafar, who was the army commander of Siraz Uddaulah. Then this battle was happened in 1757 at Plassey, and in this battle, according to the promise of Mir Jafar, he did not support to his leader, that is the Nawab of Bengal, that is Siraz Uddaulah. Thus Siraz Uddaulah was so easily defeated by the East India Company. So after the this was the first incident happened in Indian history for the administration of East India Company in Indian administration. Till 1757, the British East India Company did not enter into the Indian administration. After the 1757 only, the East India Company had started their administration in India. So after the Plassey battle in 1757, according to the promise was given by the Robert Clive to the Mir Jafar, then Mir Jafar became the Nawab of Bengal. But he became a puppet in the hands of East India Company. All the powers were in the hands of East India Company, just he was a puppet. He did not like the actions taken by the East India Company, thus he turned against to the East India Company. So when he turned against to the East India Company, then East India Company had removed the powers of Mir Jafar as the Nawab of Bengal. Then they appointed Mir Qasim as the Nawab of Bengal. So he also, in the initial years, he also became puppet in the hands of East India Company, and he also did not like the actions and the methods followed by the East India Company. He also turned against to the East India Company, and he was supported by, and at the time basically Hector Munro was the army commander of East India Company. And at the time what happened, this Mir Qasim was supported by many other leaders. The main other leaders in India were, one is the Shah Alam II, Shuja Uddaulah, and many other Indian local leaders had supported to the Mir Qasim. So thus the battle was happened in 1764 between the Mir Qasim group and the British East India Company. In this battle, British East India Company won, and they occupied the entire Bengal province, and they started direct administration in the Bengal province. This was the first incident. This was the major incident happened in Indian history. From this incident onwards, the British East India Company, they started direct administration in the Indian territories. And after that, then they continued their occupation of Indian territories. Then they attacked on the Mysore rulers, because at the time Mysore kingdom was one of the largest kingdom, and it was one of the powerful kingdom which was under the control of the Indian rulers. So there were 4 wars happened between the East India Company and the Mysore rulers. The first war, Anglo-Mysore war, was happened in from 1767 to 1769 between the Mysore rulers. Mainly at the time Mysore was under the control of Hyder Ali, and he fought with the East India Company. Then later there was a treaty between these two companies. Then again one more, the war was happened between the East India Company and the Mysore rulers. Even the Tipu Sultan also joined in the second Anglo-Mysore war, and which was happened from 1780 to 1784. And due to the treaty, again this war was ended. But in the again in 1790 to 92, 2 years, one more the war was happened between the Anglo-Mysore wars between the British East India Company and the Mysore rulers under the leadership of Tipu Sultan from the Indians and British East India Company. And at last The fourth Anglo-Mysore War was happened between the East India Company and the Tipu Sultan, which was happened from 1798 to 1799. So Tipu Sultan was killed by the East India Company. Thus, the Mysore kingdom, entire kingdom, was came under the control of the East India Company. Thus, they occupied and they started their independent administration in India. So at the time, Hyder Ali was the main. That is in the when the first Anglo-Mysore War was happened between the Hyder Ali and English East India Company, and in the second Anglo-Mysore War was happened between the Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan versus English East India Company, and the third Anglo-Mysore War was happened between Tipu Sultan and the East India Company, and the fourth Anglo-Mysore War was happened between the Tipu Sultan and the East India Company. So after the Anglo-Mysore Wars, the entire Mysore kingdom and its surroundings, the territories were under the control, came under the control of East India Company. Thus they extended their kingdom in the southern part. Then after they concentrated on the Maratha Empire, which was one of the largest empire which is located in the western part of our country. So there were three major wars were happened between the East India Company and the Maratha rulers. The first Anglo-Maratha War was happened from 1775 to 1782 between the Maratha rulers and the East India Company, and the second Anglo-Maratha War was happened between the Maratha rulers and the East India Company, which was extended from 1803 to 1805, 2 years which was happened, and the third Anglo-Maratha War was happened between the Maratha rulers to the East India Company from 1817 to 1818. So after these three Anglo-Maratha wars, the entire Maratha kingdom came under the control of the East India Company. So here we can understand that why Indian rulers failed to success on the East India Company, because at the time Indian rulers had the army, but the army did not have the powerful weapons. Then Indian rulers army did not have any proper training and the techniques, warfare and the war techniques. And at the same time East India Company had the large army with weapons, with technology, with training. Due to all these favorable conditions, they succeed on the Indian rulers and they occupied and they started their independent administration in India. So these were the main reasons for the extension and the establishment of British Empire in India. So after that they followed many other rules, many other methods to occupy the Indian kingdoms. In that, one important method followed by the British East India Company, which was known as the doctrine of lapse. This doctrine of lapse policy was introduced by the Lord Dalhousie in 1835. So according to the doctrine of lapse, if any Indian ruler died without a male heir or the successor, his or her kingdom would be comes under the control of the British East India Company. This was the policy introduced by the Lord Dalhousie. Then after introducing this policy, many of the Indian territories were occupied by the British East India Company. In this way, the first kingdom would be comes under the control of East India Company was Satara, second kingdom was Jhansi, third kingdom was Nagpur, and fourth kingdom was Udaipur, and fifth kingdom was Sambalpur, and one more kingdom Jaipur, and there were many other small independent kingdoms were occupied by the East India Company according to the doctrine of lapse, because all these kingdom rulers did not have the male child, their successors. So because of that reason, all these kingdoms were came under the control of the East India Company. So like that, the British East India Company had followed the different methods and the different policies to extend their administration to occupy their entire country from establishment of their trade centers to the real administrators. So once again we can see very clearly, so year by year what happened, how did they come to the power. In 1757 Plassey battle was the first step for entering into the Indian administration. Then after the 1764 Buxar battle they became the real rulers in India. Then after they occupied the Mysore kingdom, they fought with Mysore rulers first, second and third. Then after they followed the policy of doctrine of lapse, and also they followed one more method, that is subsidiary alliance. So this subsidiary alliance method was introduced by the Cornwallis. He was the Governor General, and according to the subsidiary alliance, no Indian ruler had the power to maintain their own armies. Whenever the kings required any army, thus East India Company had supplied the army to the king's local rulers, and after the battle and war happened, then the kings had to pay some amount to the East India Company for supplying of war needs and the soldiers. If any kingdom is unable to pay the amount to the East India Company, thus his or her kingdom would comes under the control of the East India Company. This policy was known as the subsidiary alliance. So this system was introduced by the Cornwallis. After the subsidiary alliance policy, many of the small independent kingdoms were came under the control of the East India Company, and they followed one more method which we have learned already, that is about the Anglo-Maratha wars. And by seeing all these incidents, some of the leaders, they started a movement against the British East India Company under the leadership of Jhansi Lakshmibai, Tantia Tope, Nana Saheb and many other leaders, and they together they fought against the East India Company, which was happened in 1857. This we can call it as the first war of Indian independence, but it was suppressed by the East India Company. Do you know what could be the reason why this 1857 revolt was suppressed by East India Company? Because there was no proper leadership among the Indian rulers. This was the first reason. Second, Indian soldiers did not have any weapons. That is the second reason. And the third reason, Indian soldiers did not have any training and they don't know the war techniques. And the fourth reason, there was no unity among the Indians at that time. Because of all these reasons and advantages of the East India Company, large army, weapons, training and all these things, then East India Company so easily suppressed the 1857 revolt. After the 1857 revolt, they became more powerful in India. So these were the main incidents happened in Indian history from 1757 to 1857. Then after the 1857 revolt, then what happened? There were many associations had been established in India in the different parts of the country, especially in the Madras province. Madras Presidency Association was established. Bombay Presidency Association was established. Then Kolkata Presidency was like that. In the different parts of the country, different associations had been established against to the British East India Company. But after a few years, what happened? All the leaders, they decided, especially the educated Indians, they decided to establish a common organization for the entire country to get freedom, liberty and all these things. That is why, so one of the retired British officer, that is A.O. Hume, he had established one common organization for the entire country, that is called Indian National Congress. This Indian National Congress was established in 1885 by the retired East India Company officer A.O. Hume, and there were many Indian leaders attended to the first meeting, and all the Indian leaders had appointed, that is they elected W.C. Banerjee. Umesh Chandra Banerjee was the first president of Indian National Congress. Then, after the establishment of Indian National Congress from 1885 to 1947, it was under the control of three different organizations, three different leaderships. So basically, we can divide the Indian national movement from 1885 to 1947 into the three different periods. That is the moderates period, second one is the extremist period, third one is the Gandhian period. So moderates period is from 1885 to 1905, and the extremist period was from 1905 to 1919, and the Gandhian period was from 1919 to 1947 till getting independence. So moderates, under the moderates group, the main important leaders were, one is the Dadabhai Nauroji, Gopalakrishna Gokhale, Badruddin Tyabji, then W.C. Banerjee, all were the members in the moderates groups. And under the extremist group, the main leaders were Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and the Bipin Chandrapal. These three were the famous leaders under the extremist group, and they were popularly known as the Lal Bal Pal. And Gandhian period was extended from 1919 to 1947. Mahatma Gandhi was the main leader under the Gandhian period. So, under the moderates, the main methods they followed against the British government was only giving representations and requesting the British government for their needs and the demands. So they did not follow any violent methods, any other methods against the British East India Company. Then the extremist, after the failure of moderates, extremist led the Indian National Congress under the leadership of Lal Bal Paul, but all these leaders, they followed all violent methods, directly attacking on the British officers, and their killing, like all methods were violent. Also, India did not get independence. And at last in 1919, Mahatma Gandhi took the leadership. Then he continued till 1947 because of his efforts and many other Indian national leaders' sacrifices. Then finally India got its independence in 1947. But here we can understand, from 1919 to 1947, almost all the methods were followed by Mahatma Gandhi were the all non-violent methods. Okay, this is the lesson which we have learned basic